1,200 warheads, 5 launch trajectories, 17 minutes to global detonation. The signal came at Bordantoro 14 hours. The screen lit red. The Soviet system declared nuclear launch detected. United States. Multiple targets. He was alone. The communications line had gone silent. The hotline was dark. Protocol required immediate escalation. His console blinked a countdown. Standard verification should have taken less than 60 seconds. But the override key stayed untouched. He wasn't certain, and no one else was answering. The screen demanded a response. His instructions were absolute. If confirmed, he must report the signal as valid. Reporting meant retaliation. Reporting meant launch. He did not report. Refusing to comply meant disobeying a direct nuclear chain of command. The act was not covered in the manual. There was no protocol for this. The only certainty was that failure to confirm might leave Moscow blind. No defense, no warning. But he still said no. This happened at Serpukhov 15 in the Soviet Union in 1983. At the core of the USSR's nuclear early warning system, a false alarm nearly ended the world, and one man stopped it, inside the central command hall of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces. No one doubted the inevitable. The consensus wasn't whispered. It was doctrine. If nuclear war began, the United States would launch first. The West had the economy, the precision, the satellite coverage. And above all, they had the arrogance to think they'd win. Briefings repeated the same line for years. The Americans would not wait. The belief hardened into habit. Every war game began with a surprise strike. Every simulation gave Moscow only minutes to respond. The lesson was always the same. Hesitation was extinction. On the wall hung a massive board showing U.S. launch sites, known submarine patrol zones, and expected flight times. Every commander knew the numbers by heart. 30 minutes from North Dakota, 17 from North Atlantic subs, 15 from Western Europe. The logic was clean. If a warning came from space, it was real. The satellites would not lie. When the OCO system went operational, that confidence turned to dependence. The Orbital Early Warning Network gave the Soviet Union eyes in space for the first time. The generals were told it could detect an American launch within seconds. It would give Moscow time to retaliate. Not much, but enough. So when the red signal appeared at Serpukhov 15, the assumption inside the Kremlin wasn't fear. It was expectation. The system had finally done what it was built to do. The Americans had pulled the trigger. And now it was Moscow's turn. No one questioned it. No one hesitated. No one said, "What if it's wrong? That was never part of the plan." The most terrifying doctrine ever written by human hands was 3 words long: launch on warning. In the event of a confirmed nuclear strike, not impact, just confirmed launch, the Soviet Union reserved the right to respond with full force before the enemy's missiles even landed. It was not a threat. It was policy. Codified. Rehearsed. Locked into the architecture of their command. It existed because they believed they had no choice. Unlike the United States, which had the luxury of oceans and deep redundancy, the Soviet Union faced nuclear targets less than 15 minutes away. NATO aircraft in West Germany, U.S. submarines in the Norwegian Sea, and land-based missiles in Turkey meant the Soviet mainland had no room to absorb a first strike. Survival meant reacting instantly. That's where the OCO system came in, a constellation of early warning satellites placed in highly elliptical orbits, constantly monitored infrared emissions from American missile fields. The idea was simple. If the U.S. launched, OCO would see the heat from the boosters within seconds. The system would relay a signal to Serpukhov 15, the central control facility, where duty officers would validate the data and report it up the chain. From the moment of detection, Moscow had less than 2 minutes to decide. That decision didn't require confirmation of impact. It didn't wait for ground radar. It didn't involve diplomacy. It was mathematical. If 5 missiles launched, you launched 500. If a signal came through, you verified, reported, and stepped back. The officer on shift was not allowed to doubt. The manuals were clear. Human emotion was the risk. Human hesitation was failure. The system was built to remove instinct, not depend on it. Drills reinforce the rhythm. Lights flash. Signals appear. You log the trajectory. You confirm the satellite source. You pass the alert. That sequence was followed in every simulation, every year, without variation. There was no clause for doubt, because doubt assumed error, and error, they believed, wasn't possible. The system was mechanical, cold, perfect, until it wasn't. At 4:14 hours, the main screen at Serpukhov 15 flashed red. A priority alarm cut through the control room. The satellite feed had triggered a launch event. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles originating from Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, had been fired. The readout showed perfect symmetry. Trajectories arced over the Arctic. Inbound. Each one targeted somewhere in the Soviet heartland. Flight time 22 minutes. Estimated impact. Moscow, Leningrad, command facilities. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at the center console. He wasn't the highest-ranking officer. He wasn't a nuclear expert. He was the one assigned to process the alert. His job was to follow the protocol, confirm the signal, report it to the chain of command, and trigger the possibility of launch. He didn't move. Around him, the room remained silent except for the system voice repeating missile launch detected. United States, strategic trajectory confirmed. Another officer turned to him. Is this real? Petrov looked at the screen. The signal had come from a single satellite. The timing aligned with U-Equo missile protocol. The angle matched. Everything, technically, was correct. And yet it didn't feel right. Why only 5A real U.S. first strike would involve hundreds, a full decapitation scenario. But this, 5. It made no strategic sense. Too few to disarm. Too many to be an accident. The pressure rose instantly. Officers began preparing communications. The phones to higher command were already warming up. The system demanded confirmation. Petrov was required to classify the alert as confirmed launch. But he didn't. He waited. The satellite kept reporting incoming missiles. But there was no data from ground radar. No secondary confirmation. Just a lone, perfect signal from space. He had no authority to block escalation, but he had authority to log doubt. So he did. He picked up the phone, and he said, "This is a false alarm." Then he sat in silence. Minutes passed. No flashes, no impact, no confirmation of enemy strike, just static. Then the screen returned to standby. The impossible had happened. The system had triggered a nuclear launch alert that wasn't real, and one man had chosen not to believe it. The signal reached the general staff within 90 seconds. The alert was classified as high priority. 5 inbound missiles, infrared confirmation from orbital sensors. No visual, no radar. But the satellites were trusted more than people. Petrov's report came in as a contradiction. He had labeled the launch as a false alarm, but the system hadn't been reset. The satellites continued to show missile signatures. In the eyes of command, that meant 2 things. Either the system had malfunctioned at the worst possible moment, or someone in the chain had refused to escalate. Neither was acceptable. Staff officers demanded elevation to full alert posture. Protocol dictated a launch-on-warning readiness state. Strategic bombers were prepped for ignition. Submarine commands were notified to await confirmation. No sirens, no panic, just cold switches thrown and weapons readied. The mechanism had started moving. Yet Serpukhov 15 stood still. Petrov held the line, His voice was steady. He repeated that there was no ground confirmation, no radar intercept, no atmospheric entry signature. Just infrared points he now believed were false returns. There was no change in background radiation, no deviation in signal modulation, just perfect symmetry. Too perfect. Higher command didn't accept it. They didn't call him reckless. They didn't call him wrong. They simply said, "This is not your call." But the terrifying truth was that no one else had verified the data yet. No backup officer had assumed control. The escalation chain had been built to function automatically, but it still required a single confirmation from the first officer who received the signal. And Petrov hadn't given it. Minutes ticked by. Satellite returns still showed flight. Yet nothing emerged from over the horizon. No sonic booms, no radar trails, no shock waves. The Earth stayed silent. There was no override protocol for a human who disobeyed quietly. Petrov had made a decision without debate, and now the entire command structure was forced to wait. No one wanted to be the one to pull the trigger after someone else said no. So they didn't, because the man at the console had broken the chain. The first explanation to gain traction inside Soviet high command was terrifying because it made sense. The launch, they believed, was not a full-scale nuclear exchange. It was a decapitation strike. In theory, the Americans would not need to fire hundreds of missiles. They would only need a few, if those few were aimed at the brain. Moscow, General Staff, the nuclear chain of command, a surgical opening to blind the Soviet Union long enough to prevent retaliation. It was a scenario rehearsed in secret for years. 5 missiles matched that profile. Too small for saturation, too precise for a mistake. The logic fit, a first wave to cripple communications, followed by air-launched cruise missiles from NATO bombers to finish the job. Soviet planners had modeled this very tactic in internal simulations, often concluding that such a strike could disable response capability in under 7 minutes. Inside the bunker at Serpukhov 15, several officers pointed to the math. 5 warheads, 5 major targets. It aligned with known U.S. doctrine. The satellites showed synchronized ignition. The spacing between launches was identical. There were no conflicting signals, only clean, perfect telemetry. They saw it not as a glitch. They saw it as a plan unfolding. When Petrov refused to confirm, some believed he was frozen by fear. Others believed he didn't understand the doctrine. But the most dangerous belief was that he had seen the same data and simply chose to ignore it. That made him a liability to the men staring at the display. The world was ending according to script. A few voices suggested caution, but they were drowned out. The scenario was too specific. The target list too predictable. In the context of Cold War logic, it was a move the Americans might actually make. And yet none of them could explain why there was no radar confirmation. Why 5 missiles came, but nothing followed. Why the system gave them a perfect answer before the question was even fully asked. But in a doctrine built on fear, the simplest theory wasn't always the right one. It was just the first one that made sense. When the nuclear launch was not confirmed and the minutes ticked by without impact, doubt began to enter the system. But instead of relief, command scrambled for a technical explanation that still preserved the system's credibility. What emerged next was more elaborate, more scientific, and even more dangerously wrong. They called it atmospheric distortion, an interference pattern created by high-altitude ionospheric reflection. According to this theory, sunlight had struck the upper atmosphere at a critical angle, bounced off high-altitude cloud formations over the central United States, and triggered a false infrared signature on the Soviet satellite sensors. It wasn't new. Soviet engineers had studied these effects before, but they had been considered edge cases, statistical ghosts that rarely appeared in operational conditions. This time, the angle was perfect. The seasonal equinox had placed the sun low on the horizon in just the right position to cause a thermal flare, so the new theory claimed there were no missiles at all, only light. The satellite mistook sunlight for booster exhaust. The system's algorithms had been overwhelmed by mirrored heat plumes coming from the tops of clouds, not the ground. In other words, the OCO warning system had seen ghosts. To the physicists, this was elegant. To the officers, it was infuriating. They had nearly launched on sunlight, nearly triggered retaliation based on atmospheric geometry. It was humiliating. But admitting it meant admitting that the billion-ruble satellite warning network had a blind spot no one had predicted or admitted to under field conditions. The worst truth was this: the system hadn't malfunctioned. It had worked exactly as it was designed to. The satellite detected infrared. It transmitted the data. The command post received it. All of that was technically correct. The problem wasn't in the machinery. It was in the assumption that heat meant launch, that every signal could be trusted, that space, in all its complexity, would obey protocol. They had built a machine to see war, and it had seen the sun instead. But for those 5 minutes, it didn't matter what it was, because no one in that bunker had been trained to say, wait. The greatest danger in nuclear command is not malice, it's blindness. In 1983, at the most critical moment of the Cold War, both Soviet and American intelligence systems failed to see clearly, not because of sabotage, but because of silence. The Soviet early warning network relied on a layered confirmation system, space-based infrared detection from the OCO satellites, cross-checked with terrestrial radar stations, and political intelligence gathered by the KGB and GRU. Each was supposed to validate or disprove the others. On the night of the false alarm, none of them could. The OCO satellite had seen what it was designed to see: heat, in the right place, at the right time. But the backup radar stations on Soviet soil, especially those facing the Arctic and Western Europe, were blind at that hour. Maintenance windows, signal drift, and low horizon angle meant that by the time ground radar could register anything, it would already be too late. No radar station ever detected an inbound threat. Yet the launch warning proceeded. GRU intelligence, meanwhile, showed nothing abnormal. No U.S. Commandant forces were elevated. No changes in DEFCON level. Submarine patrol patterns remained routine. NATO command channels, monitored round the clock, showed no evidence of impending launch posture. In fact, the United States had no reason to strike. Political tension was high, but diplomatic signals were not war-footing. And yet, none of that data was routed into the alert system in real time. At Serpukhov 15, the officers saw only what the satellite told them. There was no screen for KGB intercepts, no parallel display for radar silence, only one channel space. Even more alarming was the fact that Petrov's command post had no hotline to the General Staff's broader intelligence division. Cross-branch communication was restricted, siloed, and classified under different chains. What the KGB knew, the radar crews didn't. What the GRU suspected, the satellite operators never saw. The Americans were no better. U.S. intelligence had no idea that Soviet satellites were misreading cloud flares. They had no warning that a single infrared event could trigger the launch chain. The CIA believed the Soviet system required radar confirmation. They didn't know it could act independently. No one suspected the command protocols were that brittle. And so, both superpowers remained poised blind, not just to each other's intentions, but to the flaws in their own machinery. The failure was not in the equipment, it was structural. The Soviet system could see fire in the sky, but not silence on the ground. It could detect heat, but not sanity. Petrov's refusal to report was not just an act of restraint. It was an accidental correction to a systemic flaw no one had addressed. A human interruption inside a machine designed to erase humans. If he had obeyed protocol, no department would have stopped the launch, because no department had the full picture. The machine had perfect vision in one eye, and it was blind in the other. The system that nearly launched a global nuclear war was called OKO, meaning the eye. It was the crown jewel of the Soviet Union's early warning infrastructure. And on the night of September 26, 1983, it saw exactly what it was designed to see, just not what it was supposed to mean. OKO was built around a series of highly elliptical orbit satellites, placed in what's called a Molniya orbit. These were not geostationary. They passed over the northern hemisphere in long loops, spending most of their time above Soviet airspace, giving them wide-angle views of the United States and Europe. From that vantage point, they were tasked with detecting the launch of any intercontinental ballistic missile by identifying the heat plume emitted from the rocket's booster stage. The system was not theoretical. It worked. Infrared sensors aboard the satellites could detect launches within seconds of ignition. That data was then relayed to Serpukhov 15, the command center south of Moscow, where officers like Petrov were responsible for classifying the alert. But what OKO could not do, what it was never designed to do, was distinguish between a missile and a reflection. On that night, 5 satellites were active. The key satellite was flying over the Atlantic Ocean, positioned perfectly to look westward at the central United States. The sun had just dipped below the horizon in that region, and high-altitude clouds over the northern plains reflected sunlight into the upper atmosphere. The combination was rare, but not impossible. The satellite's infrared sensor picked up 5 intense flashes. From its perspective, the flashes matched the signature of missile launches. They were in the right place. The timing was perfect. The heat signatures were strong. There was no secondary data to contradict it. And so, the system declared launch confirmed. The warning algorithm had no clause for solar reflection, no filter for atmospheric glare, no margin for questioning a match that appeared perfect. The system wasn't failing. It was succeeding with blinders on. The data stream passed directly to Serpukhov 15 and to Petrov's screen. There was no cross-check with radar, no auxiliary stream from the GRU, no atmospheric model input. The system wasn't built to understand. It was built to detect, alert, and step back. It did its job, but it had never seen a sky like this. To fully understand why this false positive was so convincing, you have to look at the engineering. The infrared sensors aboard the OKO satellites were tuned for a specific spike in the thermal spectrum. Missile launches emit a narrow, intense band of heat at ignition, especially solid fuel boosters. The satellites were programmed to look for these spikes near known U.S. missile fields. Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana was one of the highest priority zones. The 5 flashes occurred precisely over Malmstrom's known grid, within a time window that matched expected attack sequencing. Even the delay between each flash matched previous simulation patterns of how the U.S. might stagger launches to confuse Soviet response. In other words, the reflection looked exactly like the war. What made this possible was not just sun and cloud. It was timing. The satellite caught the exact moment when the angle of sunlight, the cloud reflectivity, and the orbital window aligned. This optical illusion, invisible to the human eye from the ground, was enough to trigger the full launch warning in orbit. And still, none of this was known at the time. Petrov didn't have access to atmospheric data. He didn't know about the cloud cover. He didn't have a real-time meteorological link to the satellite. All he had was the pattern on the screen and his own understanding of doctrine. That's what saved the world, because Petrov understood that 5 missiles made no sense. A real American strike would be massive, sudden, total. Not 5, not spaced, not small. In his mind, the data didn't match the reality of nuclear war. He suspected a system flaw, but he had no proof. He couldn't see the clouds. He couldn't calculate the angle of the sun. He had only his instinct and the courage not to act. After the event, Soviet engineers spent weeks tracing the root cause. They reconstructed the satellite path. They modeled the infrared flares. They reviewed the historical weather records and ran simulation after simulation until the theory became undeniable. It was light. Reflected sunlight off high-altitude clouds had caused the satellite to report 5 false missile launches. It was the kind of problem that could never be fully solved, only mitigated. In response, the Soviets began developing dual confirmation systems that required both satellite and radar data before escalation. Later satellites were equipped with updated filters to better distinguish between direct and reflected infrared sources. Atmospheric models were added to pre-launch calculations. But none of those fixes existed in 1983. That night, the system was blind, and the man inside it saw more clearly than the machine. What nearly caused the end of the world wasn't madness, or hostility, or sabotage. It was a technical artifact, a gap in understanding between what machines can see and what humans can interpret. It didn't matter that the system worked. What mattered was that the system didn't know when it was wrong. There was no AI, no override, only a man in a chair, watching numbers and deciding not to believe them. OCO remained operational for decades after, eventually replaced by more modern systems with better safeguards. But in every future doctrine rewrite, one phrase began to appear in Soviet manuals: human judgment must remain in the loop, because on the night when everything said fire, one officer whispered no, and nothing happened. The countdown was unofficial, but it was real. At Serpukhov 15, the warning had been active for nearly 3 minutes. The screen still showed 5 American missiles in flight. The red status lights had not gone dark. Every officer in the bunker could feel the clock ticking louder with each breath. A junior technician whispered, "We should report." No one answered. In a nearby room, a second officer prepared to send confirmation up the chain. His hands hovered over the radio switch. He looked at Petrov, the duty officer. "Waiting." Petrov shook his head. Not yet. Every light on the board said, "Launch." The algorithm said, "Launch." The satellite said, "Launch." Petrov said, "Wait." The phone line to the general staff was open. The protocol required him to state the alert level. He could say, "Confirmed launch." If he said those words, the system would escalate. Strategic rocket forces would go to their highest posture. Weapons would move from storage to readiness. Submarines would break silence. He did not say them. Instead, he gave a neutral report. Signal detected. Satellite origin. No radar confirmation. Awaiting secondary input. There was no secondary input. Nothing came. No blips on ground radar. No changes in atmospheric scan. No telemetry beyond the satellite's flare. And so he held. Minute 4 passed. Then 5. The silence deepened. The room was motionless. Command was expecting escalation, not indecision. A real American launch would be unforgiving. Every moment of hesitation reduced the Soviet window to retaliate. The system was built to act fast, not to pause. But Petrov paused anyway. He had made up his mind, but said nothing to the others. His voice was calm, procedural, deliberate. He recorded the signals. He logged the timestamps. He continued the checklist as if nothing extraordinary were happening. Inside, he was certain of only one thing. If he was wrong, there would be no time to correct it. But if he was right, he'd just prevented the death of hundreds of millions. And no one would know. At minute 8, the screen cleared. The missile indicators vanished. No impact. No secondary confirmation. No war. The satellite switched to routine scan. The alarms ceased. The room didn't cheer. No one said a word. The operators returned to their stations, pretending nothing had happened. Petrov closed his logbook. He had disobeyed the most dangerous system in the world by doing nothing at all. He saved it by standing still. After the incident, there was no ceremony, no announcement, and no medal. There was only paperwork. Stanislav Petrov filed his report, classified the signal as a system anomaly, and marked the event as resolved. His shift ended. He went home. No one outside that bunker would know how close the world had come to ending that night. But inside Soviet command, something fundamental had changed. The machine had done everything it was designed to do. It had acquired, it had verified, it had alerted. But it had nearly killed us all. The doctrine that had driven Soviet nuclear readiness for 2 decades launch on warning was not just shaken, it was punctured. The very concept of trusting data over doubt had failed its first real-world test. And the test had failed not because the satellite malfunctioned, but because no one had expected it to succeed incorrectly. For years, Soviet planners believed that their greatest threat was American deception or first-strike ambition. They prepared for surprise attacks, decapitation strikes, and decoy maneuvers. They built a command system where the human was a checkpoint, not a decision-maker. But Petrov's refusal exposed a deeper truth. The system was brittle not because of its hardware, but because of its certainty. It had no margin for disbelief, no protocol for hesitation, no clause for sanity. It was designed to force action, not to allow reason. That night, the human in the loop, once considered the weakest link, became the only reason the system didn't activate the end of civilization. Petrov's superiors weren't grateful. He was reprimanded for filing his report incorrectly. He was removed from satellite duty weeks later. The military never acknowledged the crisis. But in private, the doctrine began to shift. New models were introduced requiring ground radar confirmation. Satellite triggers were downgraded to partial inputs, no longer allowed to initiate escalation alone. The KGB and GRU were ordered to expand joint monitoring protocols. Intelligence was told to cross-check environmental conditions. Engineers were instructed to study solar alignment impacts on orbital sensors. Petrov had not just interrupted a false alarm. He had rewritten the logic of nuclear restraint. The irony was sharp. The Soviet system had always feared the human element. It believed men could crack under pressure, disobey orders, or act emotionally. That's why automation was prioritized. That's why launch decisions were chained to protocol. But when the machine saw light and called it fire, it was the human, the frightened, isolated, exhausted officer who saw through the pattern. The new reality was unavoidable. No algorithm could predict weather like instinct. No command logic could pause like conscience. The system had limits, and so did the certainty behind it. What saved the world wasn't better code. It was one man's willingness to break from it. And what terrified the system most was that it worked. For decades, the world never knew. There were no headlines, no documentaries, no parades. Stanislav Petrov returned to civilian life in quiet disgrace. He lived in a small apartment outside Moscow. He worked a desk job. He rarely spoke of the night he held back the apocalypse. Even his neighbors didn't know. The report remained classified. His name never appeared in awards lists. There was no entry in the official record that described the time he stopped a nuclear war by simply refusing to follow the data. He died in 2017 alone in his home. A neighbor found him days later. No fanfare, no final salute, just silence. Years earlier, a journalist had found him by accident. The story trickled into the West. A few nations sent him letters. One gave him a plaque. Another named a peace prize in his honor. But the governments that nearly ended the world never called. The system that tried to erase him succeeded for a long time. But eventually, history found him again. There is no monument at Serpukhov 15, no bronze statue where he sat. The console is gone. The satellite long deorbited. The bunker is sealed. And yet, in every nuclear protocol written since, in every failsafe added to every launch system on Earth, there is now a space for one final step. One human step. One last pause. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even supposed to be on shift that night. But he was. And because he was, we still are. He did not save the world with force. He saved it with a single decision not to believe what the machine told him. One refusal. One pause. One man.